today's Nobel laureate, Professor James Robinson, and all the honorable faculty members and distinguished guests, and our dear students, good morning.
Good morning.
Today, we are truly honored to be able to invite Professor James Robinson, and a recipient for the 2024 Prize in Economics Sciences. Professor Robinson currently is a professor, a faculty member at the University of Chicago. And Harris School of Public Policy is one of the world's leading scholars in political economy, institutional economies, and also comparative developments. And later on, you will know that his expertise in Latin America and also Asia area is quite impressive. So in 2024, Professor Robinson, together with his longtime collaborator, Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics Sciences for their groundbreaking contribution to the theory of institutional formation and evolution. Their research, I need to read through this, otherwise I'll forget your significant contribution. So your research demonstrates the national prosperity does not stem from geography, culture, or short-term policy shifts, but rather from the establishment of inclusive political and economic institutions. And their influential book, Why Nation Fell, today's title, so has become one of the most impactful book, and that to influence the contemporary political economies and public policy. And it has been translated into 40 languages and still leading the discussion of global developments. Professor Robinson has also emphasized the powerful historical past dependence of institutional evolution through cases such as Latin America's colonial systems, state capacity in sub-Saharan Africa, and democratic transition across Asia. He illustrated these important areas with his new ideas on the different characteristics of these countries or area, especially the institutions emerge, persist, adapt, and reshape the society over centuries. Notably, he has highlighted Taiwan as South Korea, and he just mentioned that South Korea, he knows more. Taiwan, a little bit less, but then we welcome you to come to Taiwan even more, so you will understand Taiwan's situation even better. So these two are the successful story, because the inclusive institutional system and the observation that this observation will resonate with us all today here. So I'm confident that his insight will offer great inspiration to us all. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome, or extending our warm welcome to Professor Robinson.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Very happy to be here in Taiwan again at the National Taiwanese University, Taiwan National, and I'm just very excited to talk about why nations fail. So I'm going to talk about why nations fail. I'm going to talk about economic growth and comparative economic growth and the politics and institutions of comparative economic growth. But, I'm not sure it needs to be said at this moment in the world. There's many things that I don't understand. Now that after getting the Nobel Prize, what I've realized is that you have to start every talk by mentioning things that you don't understand. Because after you get the Nobel Prize, people start taking you so seriously that you get into this state of mind where, you're casting, what did Shakespeare say? Casting pearls amongst swine or something. And it's kind of ludicrous. People take you much too seriously. And, as every academic knows, you have to stay very critical and very humble because the world is so complicated. The social world is so complicated. And, there's so many things that we don't really understand. And so you'll see that by the end. So I think, we made some progress on these topics, but the world's in an exciting place. And hopefully I'll end up talking a little bit about the exciting place we're in. Okay, so with that, self-loathing start, my wife would say, let me talk about comparative economic growth. So here's some data on comparative economic growth. You have to search a little bit to find data on Taiwan when you're doing research on comparative economic growth, I realized. And there's a project called Our World in Data, which if you don't know it, it's a really cool project and it has very nice graphics, so I like using Our World in Data. It has a beautiful interface and, but most of the data they don't have any data on Taiwan, but I did manage to dig up, some data from the Madison project. So Angus Madison was a kind of, I don't know what he was really. He was an economic historian. He was a kind of polymath who had this project for many years at the OECD in Paris, constructing historical national accounts. So it turns out Madison has data on Taiwan and it's been updated by Jutta Bolt and Jan Leuten van Zanden. So, here's the picture of economic growth over the past 70 years. So, some of these things are very familiar and I'll talk a little bit about them. There's North Korea, Why Nations Fail. That's one of the poster childs of our book. Down at the bottom there, level of income per capita. So this is just a measure of, income per capita, the value of, average value of goods and services produced in these different countries. You see there the meteoric rise of South Korea and, of course, Taiwan. So according to this data, which I downloaded yesterday, Taiwan actually is doing much better than South Korea and even has a level of income per capita which is significantly higher than Western European countries. So over that period, you can see the rise of China, you can see the rise of the United States. Of course, the United States has more or less stayed on top, and there goes Singapore. Okay, so how do I think about these patterns of comparative economic development? Why has North Korea done so badly over the past 70 years, experiencing famine? The life expectancy in North Korea is about 10 years less than it is in South Korea. And that's not a very historical thing. If you go back, those things converge pretty rapidly. And if anything, in the 1940s, North Korea was actually more industrialized and more developed economically than South Korea was. So what explains that divergence? I'll come back to it. It's particularly interesting. How would we think about those patterns? Well, I think the way I think about those patterns really, and the way most economists start thinking about those patterns is with the work that Robert Solow did in the 1950s, for which he received the Nobel Prize. And Robert Solow was interested in kind of what lies behind those long-run patterns of economic growth. And he said, ultimately, of course, there's capital accumulation and there's demography, but ultimately this is about innovation. It's about technology. It's about kind of new ideas. And I always like to motivate that, since I'm British, with the Industrial Revolution. Back in the glory days of Britain, in the late 18th century. It's a while ago, but we had our moment in the sun. And what was the Industrial Revolution? It was inventing things. It was the invention of the factory system, mechanization of production. Adam Smith's pin factory, specialization, division of labor. So production was organized in new ways that made individuals much more productive. New forms of power, the steam engine, new forms of transportation, railway, road, tarmac. So it was all innovations that led to this economic growth starting in Britain in the late 18th century. Okay? And so that we still believe, economists believe, that this is the key to kind of long-run economic growth. Okay? And it's the key to looking at those differences across countries. So one of the reasons, for example, at this level of discussion that North Korea, is as poor as it is that North Korea uses much worse, much less productive technology than South Korea. Okay, so let me give you an example of a technology that I'll come back to that's particularly interesting in the North Korean case, as you'll see, which is a light bulb. Okay, so this is not from the first industrial revolution. You could say this is from the second industrial revolution. And this is the patent that Thomas Edison, the inventor of the light bulb, came up with and took out in 1880. Okay, so here's a tectonic, innovation, light bulbs, kind of spills over into every domain of society. And the patent, is interesting in lots of ways. Okay, so it's interesting as what I'm going to call an institution. Okay, what's a patent? So at the time of the Constitution of the United States, it was stipulated that a patent system was going to be created, and the first Congress wrote a patent law and created a board. And if you came up with an invention, an idea, you'd go to the patent board and you'd file for a patent, and they would evaluate whether or not your innovation was sufficiently novel to warrant getting a patent. And the patent protected your intellectual property rights. Okay? So that's very important because innovation, you come up with ideas, new ideas. Okay? And that can make people much more productive, like a light bulb. But once somebody invented the light bulb, it's very easy for other people to look at it and sort of copy it. And, you could try to hide it or whatever, but, light bulbs are pretty evident. What's that thing shining brightly? Oh, it's a light bulb. What goes into that? So then you can reverse engineer it. And so the important point about that is if you're an innovator, the fact that when you create an idea, you create some new technology, other people can borrow it very easily, sort of means that you're only going to benefit from a small portion of the wealth that you create with that innovation, because other people can take it and they can create wealth too. Of course, that's good for society, but it undermines your incentives, or it reduces your incentives, or as economists would say, it drives a wedge between the kind of private and the social incentives. Okay, so the idea of a patent is to protect your intellectual property rights, to stop people borrowing your technology or using it, and bring your private incentives closer to the social incentives, to align those things. Okay, so it's about incent. So the patent, I like the patent. I'm talking about innovation and new ideas and new technology. The patent is a beautiful example of something which is meant to kind of create incentives for innovation, for new ideas. Okay, and I'm going to call it an institution because it's a law. It's a kind of particular type of institution, but it's a kind of rule that creates incentives and opportunities for people. So an institution, institutions are sort of defined in a very broad way as, structures in society that create incentives and opportunities, that kind of channel people's energies in one way or another, incentivize or disincentivize people. All right, so I'm going to give lots of examples, but this is a very concrete example. It's a law, if you like. And the law creates incentives for innovation. And there's a clear procedure for how one gets a patent. And it's not just about the law, but it's also about the enforcement of the law, meaning Thomas Edison got his patent, but the state was ready to enforce his patent, to enforce his intellectual property rights. So you need to create state institutions which can enforce property rights to really create incentives. Okay? And, it's important as an institution because it creates incentives for innovation, but it's also a particular type of institution, okay? And to say something about that, I want to ask the question, who was Edison? Here he is in his lab. Edison was a very brilliant man. He had over 1,000 patents in his own name. He was just a real kind of the archetypal innovator, okay? And what's interesting about him is his social background. So the great economic historian who was one of my mentors, he passed away at a very young age, unfortunately, but he was one of the mentors one of my mentors early in my career, Kenneth Sokolov. What Ken did was he spent years looking at the social background of innovators, and he did that through patents. So he got the patents and he looked at who took out the patents, and then he investigated who were these people, like who were their families, where did they come from, what was the kind of the sociology of patenting. And what he showed is that patentees, kind of innovators, come from everywhere in society. Edison's father was a roofing contractor. He was homeschooled by his mother. He wasn't an elite. The family didn't have any money. In fact, to raise capital, to build his famous lab, he had to sell off innovations early on because he couldn't get loans from banks. So he was just a very brilliant man. And what Ken's work showed is that if you look at people, patentees, people who took out patents, innovators, they come from everywhere in society, okay? They could be elites, they could be non-elites, their parents could be professional people, or they could be farmers, or and you know, ideas, talent, creativity is spread out everywhere in society. And you don't know where that is. I don't know where it is. The government doesn't know where it is. So the key thing to harness all of that creativity, to create an innovative, dynamic society and economy, is to create a system of rules that allows all that talent to come to the top. So we call the patent an example of what I'm going to call an inclusive economic institution. And inclusive means creates broad-based patterns of incentives and opportunities. So what does that mean practically here? It means if you came up with an idea, you could take it to the patent board, you paid the same fee as anybody else, the patent board evaluated your idea, and if they thought it was a real innovation, they protected your intellectual property rights. So everyone got their intellectual property rights protected by the state. So it has this kind of aspect of, you might call like a level playing field. Okay, so inclusive, like everyone gets access to this system on the same terms. And I think that's really, what our research suggests is the big difference between poor and rich countries. The big difference between South Korea and North Korea is that in North Korea, there's all of this untapped, underutilized talent and ability because no one can get to the top in North Korea. And in South Korea, imperfection, no doubt, you can get to the top. Okay, so that's about the system of institutions and the system of rules. Okay, something a little bit more systematic. How would I measure? I could look at patenting laws, but it's difficult to get information on how well patent laws are enforced. And looking at the laws themselves, I won't go into details. Is a kind of interesting. Many countries, like in Latin America, have beautiful patent laws. I know the people who wrote them, but they're impossible to enforce, So let me, instead of, I alluded to an idea that you might call the rule of law, this idea of a kind of level playing field where everyone gets treated in the same way. Let me call that, one way of thinking about the rule of law or a facet of the rule of law. Here's an index of the rule of law from the World Bank, averaged at the country level between 2019, 2022. And you can see that's highly correlated with the measure of income per capita on the vertical axis. So I started off by talking about these patterns of comparative economic development. Here's the correlation between the rule of law and income per capita. So countries with higher rule of law tend to be more prosperous, have higher levels of income per capita. So you might ask, is that a causal relationship? I'm not going to dwell too much on that today, but a lot of our research for which we got the prize was about kind of establishing the causality in that relationship. Okay, and just focus on the left figure here. Here I'm correlating the rule of law not with income per capita, but going back to Robert Solow. When Robert was working on the determinants of long-run growth that I started off with, he kind of came up with a concept which he called total factor productivity. So total factor productivity was his measure of kind of technological advance or technological sophistication of a society. Okay, it's really a measure of how well your factors of production are being used. Think about North Korea. North Korea has lots of workers, but they produce very little because they're being very inefficiently used. They're being very inefficiently used for lots of reasons. They have very bad technology. They're also disincentivized by the whole kind of system and whatever. So total factor productivity picks up a lot of stuff. But you can see there's a lot of variation here, but it's also highly correlated with this rule of law index. So countries with higher levels of rule of law have higher levels of total factor productivity and kind of more productive technology, more productive workers and factors of production. Okay, so let me point out something that might become important later on when I talk about China a little bit, which is to say, one thing which is a little bit kind of special about the British case, or indeed the US case, talking about Edison and talking about the institutions necessary to stimulate innovation, is you might think there's an important distinction between kind of who goes first and latecomers. So Britain had an industrial revolution at a time when there was no real industrialized country in the world. There was the Netherlands, and and there were bits and pieces. I don't want to argue about the details, but basically there was never a kind of industrial society the way Britain emerged as in the late 18th century. Okay, so you could say once that's been established, once that happened, once somebody had an industrial revolution, then they have more advanced technology, and now you're in the world of what people call latecomer development, like Taiwan. Okay, so when Taiwan industrialized, or when economic growth took off in Taiwan in the 1960s or 1970s, Taiwan had a lot of role models of countries that had already been very successful economically in Western Europe, in North America, in Japan, much closer to home. So that's an interesting context where you don't have to invent the light bulb. You can borrow it from somewhere else. Okay, so I do want to say, there's different options, and we'll talk about that later on as I get into this. You can borrow ideas. I have steel. You can adopt technology. There's a lot of violation of intellectual property rights, as you're probably aware. China's gone a long way by ignoring intellectual property rights. And you can also use people, bring people. People have knowledge, they have human capital, they have skills. For example, if I looked at Qatar, or I looked at the economic success of the United Arab Emirates in the last 50 years, they haven't succeeded by doing a lot of patenting and having a lot of Thomas Edisons, or Richard Arkwrights. They brought technology, and they brought capital, and they brought human capital and people, who have that knowledge and who have that understanding. And, so for example, just to illustrate that, almost 80% of people living in Qatar were born outside of Qatar. So that's a model of extremely successful development. And it's also true about Singapore, by the way. So, so Singapore, it's almost 50% of the population were born outside Singapore. So that's a very different model from China, of course, and it's a very different model from South Korea. And I put this up here just because, in the United States, there's a lot of angst about the proportion of people in the United States who are kind of born outside the United States, like myself, heaven forbid. But you can see that the United States is a kind of joke compared to other parts of the world that have embraced this model of how can we learn from other people and how can we cooperate with other people. Okay, so just to allude to that. Okay, so that's what I'm calling the stages of economic growth. And what I want to say about that, what I want to say about these different models here, without going into details, is they all rely on institutions as well. Okay, so if you want people to come, if you want capital to come, you also need to have inclusive institutions. All right, so there's a lot of variation in different strategies there depending on your stage of development. All I want to say at this point is that doesn't reduce the importance of institutions. Okay, all right. So now let me start talking about politics, which is to say, what I'm claiming so far, I can hardly claim to have convinced you, but what I've asserted is that there's this connection between inclusive economic institutions, innovation, and economic growth. Okay? Now imagine you believe that. Then it just seems like a no-brainer, as we say in the United States, a no-brainer to create an inclusive society economically. I mean, who wouldn't want to be like South Korea or Taiwan? What is it that the North Koreans don't understand? So one idea would be, of course, maybe they just have really bad economists in North Korea. Okay. And that's probably true, actually. I've never met a North Korean economist. But I would say that's probably a symptom rather than a cause of the problems in North Korea. Okay? The reason I like talking about North Korea is this kind of extreme case, but what's beautiful about it is you all kind of know what the right answer is. Okay? And the right answer, of course, is again illustrated by light bulbs. To go back to my theme of light bulbs, here's the North Korea night, very black, very dark. Economists nowadays love using this night light as a kind of measure of economic development and prosperity. And it's beautiful in this picture, it's so kind of visceral. It just reveals the enormous gap between South Korea, North Korea, and indeed, China just across the border there. There's a bit of Pyongyang. You can see it's sort of like bright and wonderful, but you can't go there unless you have permission. So back to politics. Okay, so in some sense, everything I told you now, I wasted almost 25 minutes of my talk talking about economics. But most of the innovation that Professor Acemoglu and I did was about the politics of this, like trying to understand the politics that lies behind this, okay? And the politics that lies behind the poverty of North Korea and the prosperity of South Korea, okay? And to do that, and to talk about that, let me just make a distinction between, what I've been calling inclusive economic institutions and the opposite. Okay, the opposite I'm going to call extractive economic institutions. So if you think of inclusive economic institutions as economic institutions that create broad-based patterns of incentives and opportunities, extractive economic institutions do the opposite. Okay, they block incentives, they block opportunities. Maybe they create them for some people. Okay, but they don't harness the latent talent of society. Okay, so the poverty of a place like North Korea, or many countries where I've worked in sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, we attribute to them having extractive economic institutions. But the reason they have extractive economic institutions is because of the politics, okay? And I think, the situation in North Korea is the way it is, you could say, for one or two potential reasons. The most obvious reason why North Korea has extractive economic institutions is it has what I'm going to call extractive political institutions, meaning political power is allocated to the Korean Workers' Party. Okay? So we sort of say getting inclusive economic institutions is a political problem. Okay? And to get inclusive economic institutions, you need to have inclusive political institutions. And there's two dimensions to that. One is the distribution of power in society. That's the problem in North Korea. The problem in North Korea is that power is in the hands of a narrow clique. The narrow clique creates incentives and opportunities for themselves, but not for everybody else. Okay? There's another aspect or another dimension of inclusive institutions, inclusive political institutions, which is the capacity or the power of the state. Okay, go back to my discussion of the patent law. It's not enough to write a law, you have to enforce the law. And to enforce the law, you need, like what social scientists would call state capacity. Okay, you need a state which can raise taxes, which can enforce regulation, which can punish people that violate intellectual property rights. So that's the second component. Of course, ironically, North Korea does have quite a lot of state capacity. It's rather good at controlling its population. Okay. But what it lacks is the first element. Okay, it's not enough to have state capacity. You need to have a distribution of power in society that guarantees that capacity is used in the collective interest. Okay, so that's the problem in North Korea. Okay, so let me put the argument together in a kind of simple diagram. Okay, so on the columns are the economic institutions, inclusive and extractive. And the rows are political institutions. So North Korea down in the bottom right-hand corner it's poor because it has extractive economic institutions, and it has extractive economic institutions because it has extractive political institutions. Rich countries in the top left cell, like Taiwan, are there because they have inclusive economic institutions, and they're in synergy with inclusive political institutions. So what about the off-diagonals? The off-diagonals, you have a kind of mix of inclusive and extractive. What do we say about that? Extractive economic institutions with inclusive politics, or in the case of China, which I'm going to talk about now, inclusive economic institutions, relatively speaking, at least compared to what they were like in 1978, but extractive political institutions. So what the book and what our theory says about those sort of off-diagonals in that matrix is they're unstable. Okay, you can't stay in these off-diagonals. Okay, so let me just restate the argument, and then I'll start talking about some of these problematic cases, okay? So prosperity needs inclusive economic institutions. The only really reliable way of getting inclusive economic institutions is to have inclusive political institutions. How do you create a system that creates inclusion in the economic sphere? People have to have political power and political rights for that to happen. I think that's what the evidence and that's what history suggests, okay? Now, what we do say in the book, whoops, I'm going to jump this because I'm running out of time. So what we do say in the book is, in some circumstances, you can have economic growth, which we call extractive growth. And that can happen when part of what it takes to be inclusive politically is in place, where you have a state with kind of capacity, with the ability to build infrastructure and organize society and push development. But what we claim about that is that that tends to be transitory. Okay, so there's many instances in world history of what we call extractive growth, but it tends to be transitory. Okay, so to think about the Taiwanese or the South Korean case, you're thinking about, the Kuomintang, or you're thinking about President Park or the military in South Korea. Wasn't there very rapid economic growth in those circumstances? Yes, there was, but it was extractive growth, and it's growth that would not have persisted had there not been the transition towards more inclusive political institutions. So if I was going to go back to the diagram and ask, how did South Korea or Taiwan go from being poor and extractive to rich and inclusive, I would say they kind of went the same way that China did, meaning the economy became much more inclusive, but then they made a transition from extractive to inclusive political institutions. So they went into the bottom left cell of the matrix, but then they moved up to the top left, okay? And that movement was kind of crucial for sustaining that prosperity, okay? And taking it to the next level also, you could say. Okay, so what's a lead example of the transitoriness of extractive growth? Well, the Soviet Union is a great example. When I was a student at the London School of Economics in the early 1980s, we were still being taught that if you wanted rapid economic growth, the Soviet Union had the model that you had to use. Central planning was the way to go. And now, students, if they've heard of the Soviet Union, they kind of laugh when you say that, because the Soviet Union came down in history as being this sort of economic disaster, basically, that collapsed in the 1980s when President Gorbachev tried to kind of reform the institutions. But actually, if you go back and you look at the period from the kind of first 5-year plan in the mid-1920s, for about 50 years, the Soviet Union did very well. In fact, it was enshrined in every textbook. So here's Paul Samuelson's 1961 textbook, has the Soviet Union overtaking or catching up to GDP or GNP in the year 2000, catching up with the United States in the year 2000. And of course, the Soviet Union had great technological triumphs. They put the first dog in space. Here's Laika, who went round the world 3 times before burning up. But this kind of seems kind of ludicrous in the technology world, the world of technology we're in today. But this was a sort of massive technological triumph in the 1950s that panicked, the United States government and the CIA in 1957. That's a box of matches with Laika on it. Anyway, okay. 1967, keep going. 2010, catch-up gets delayed. If you go through there's many, I think there's about 20 editions of this book. So, but this picture, the catch-up keeps getting delayed. And then in the 1980s, late 1980s, I know because as a graduate student, I was hired to help with one of the revisions on this textbook. This picture disappeared. Okay. Of course, by that time, it was sort of obvious that the Soviet Union wasn't going to catch up with the United States. But then, of course, a decade later, it comes back with the Soviet Union replaced with China. Okay. Now, I mentioned that not to compare the Soviet Union with China in the sense that, China is very different in lots of ways. Okay, and I want to try to talk about that. I don't have time, but I can just throw it out there. It's different in lots of ways. Okay, it managed to export all sorts of things, okay? But I think what's interesting about this example is it shows, you know, how we can be fooled. You know, the entire economics profession, the CIA, you know, the US, everyone can be fooled, including the Soviet leadership, into thinking that they've solved this problem, they've cracked this problem. You know, we have a way of kind of taking over, you know. When I was a student, you know, in England, also in the late 1970s, there was a book written by Ezra Vogel, I guess an economist at the Kennedy School at Harvard, called Japan as Number One, basically predicting that Japan had the right model, and now Japan was going to take over and the US would have to adapt to the Japanese way of doing business and the Japanese way of organizing production. And so just to remind you, like, we can be wrong about this stuff, you know, although the details, of course, are important, right? Why transitory? Well, here's my view of why transitory. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, okay? Lord Acton. So, you know, that's the simple kind of why nations view version of why, you know, you can't have inclusive institutions at the whim of autocracy, okay? Because power, once you concentrate power, without checks and balances, without accountability, power tends to get abused, okay? And that ends up being disastrous for citizens and for society, but it also ends up being disastrous for the economy, okay? So that's, I think, if you look at the book, those are what you see in these examples of power tends to corrupt and why extractive growth is transitory, okay? So I'm a little nervous. I don't have time to get into this because I've just been enjoying myself too much and kind of holding forth and whatever.
You can add 10 minutes.
But what I did was I made up some slides to kind of, which is sort of beyond why nations fail, to sort of talk about like what's going on, you know, in these East Asian examples. Like, what's going on with, like, how is it possible, despite, you know, the claim about the connection between inclusive political institutions, inclusive economic institutions, and economic growth, that you seem to have economic growth, successful experiences of economic growth under extractive political institutions in many East Asian countries, okay? So what I argue about South Korea or Taiwan, what we argue in the book, is this argument that I already made, that this is a kind of transitory phase. It's not necessary, but it can happen, okay, in some circumstances. I think, you know, and the way I would talk about that is, you know, it happened because of particular historical aspects. You could even say cultural aspects of East Asian society. You know, like for me, who's worked most of their life in sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, what's remarkable about East Asian societies is just this history of political centralization, of state centralization, you know, of a culture kind of supporting that centralization. You know, the one Asian country I've worked in any kind of detail was actually the Philippines. You know, but when you get to the Philippines, you think, okay, great, this is just like Latin America. It's like Colombia. You know, I understand this. You know, but that's not what Taiwan is like. That's not what Japan is like. That's not what China or Korea is like. So the Philippines had a very different history. But I think that however you want to describe that history, that, you know, the construction of the state or the absence of the construction of the state, you know, of course, there's also a history of kind of mercantile capitalism. You have lots of role models. You know, you could say you have historical role models after China was, you know, the most successful economy in the world for hundreds of years, or maybe even 1,000 years until, you know, until the British Industrial Revolution. So there's a kind of a set of initial conditions. Why are those initial conditions important? Well, I already said you need to have a state with capacity to have extractive growth in the first place. And these other conditions are important because they kind of help you think, you know, if I make society more inclusive, is it going to be successful economically? Okay. Like, for example, in the South Korean case, it's very clear that when President Park decided he was going to push the economy in the 1960s and was going to push exporting, he was looking at Japan and saying, look, the Japanese are doing it. There's no reason we can't do that in Korea, okay? We can follow that model and it's going to be successful here, okay? So that kind of context matters, but I think from our perspective, the critical thing in allowing for this extractive growth, and I want to push on this because I think it helps understand this Chinese case, the most important thing is, how does politics intertwine with this? Okay? So when I talk about extractive economic institutions, you might think the obvious reason to have extractive economic institutions is to kind of enrich yourself. Okay? So it's true, in North Korea, that, the elites are doing way better than everybody else. They're importing lots of cognac and, the president has a wave pool in his house and, but I think that's probably only a small part of the problem with getting extractive economic institutions. The big part is about politics, is about using what stops you creating economic institutions that generate prosperity is they get undermined by politics. Okay, you have to use the state for controlling power, for delivering patronage. Okay, you have to manipulate the economy by giving monopolies, by giving favors. Why do you do that? Okay, to control power. The reason North Korea is organized the way it is, I'm sure ideology is part of that, but the reason that there are extractive economic institutions, for me, that's fundamentally political. It's about controlling people. You need to control people because your grip on power is very weak. Your legitimacy is weak. And you use the economy as a tool for controlling people. So to have extractive economic growth, what I'm calling extractive economic growth, somehow you have to disentangle the politics from economic institutions. Okay, so if I was going to say, why has Chinese economic growth been so successful, much more successful, than you believe? We wrote Why Nations Fell 15 years ago. We took this view, Chinese economic growth is extractive growth, it's transitory, it's going to stop. I don't know how it's going to stop or when it's going to stop, but it's going to stop. So why has it been more successful than we would have predicted? I think the core of that is understanding how in China they've managed to kind of extract the politics out of the economic institutions. They haven't completely managed to do it, but they've done it enough that there's still innovation and there's still investment. Okay, so that's the way I kind of want to talk about this, all right? And I think there's some hypotheses that I can throw out. I don't have time to talk about it. One is, which is discussed a lot in the United States at the moment, is what academics in political science call like smart authoritarianism. Like somehow China has managed to extract the politics. It manages to allow innovation. It manages to allow entrepreneurship. And it uses other instruments to control people that don't mess up the economy. That's an innovation in world history, if it's true. You can all think of this social credit system, the use of technology to kind of monitor people. And so I think I'm not pretending that I understand it. I'm just trying to say, let's take my theory, let's apply it to this Chinese case. Where does it lead you? It leads to this point, and to trying to understand mechanisms that might be able to explain how China has disentangled the politics from economic organization. Okay? So I think one idea is there's just new instruments that have never really existed before that allow you to separate the two things. Another thing you could sort of say is, if you look at the history of East Asia, the history of East Asia is very different from Western history philosophically, in terms of political institutions. There's just much more of a history of the kind of political centralization and the sort of legitimacy of centralized state institutions than there is in the Western world. And that's maybe something that people are able to kind of leverage. And I think, for someone like me who's also taught, Chinese students for many, many years, one thing that really is kind of striking about Chinese students compared to other students, I always like the comparison to India, is this obsession with merit, like this idea of like meritocracy and merit, that's a heck of a sociological principle for building a capitalist society, okay? We don't have that in England, by the way. We don't have it. It took many, many, many centuries to construct something approximating that, But the English aristocracy, was not chosen through an examination system. It was a bunch of like medieval warlords, who were kind of domesticated, by the Tudors. So what I'm saying here is I'm kind of saying, for me, the discussion is about these features, historical features, institutional features, cultural features that somehow allow this Chinese model to kind of keep going? Okay, again, without pretending that I understand it. So let me end by talking about how transitory is transitory. Well, you can point to innovation, BYD, again, this is a great example of entrepreneurship, of, yeah, sure, the government pouring billions of dollars of subsidies into it, but it's another example of upward social mobility, entrepreneurship, kind of fascinating. The electric car industry, you can all think of AI, whatever. But I always have in mind this picture of Jack Ma, sort of iconic of the first wave of Chinese entrepreneurship. What happened to Jack Ma? He made a mild criticism of the government regulatory, and he disappeared. Like he was airbrushed out of Chinese history, like Stalin, dealing with Bukharin or something, or Trotsky. So I guess my view is still, maybe I'm out of date and AI will, we won't need humans anymore. The machines will do the innovation and we just control people and we put them in like boxes and like Jeremy Bentham or, Brave New World or whatever. But I still have this feeling that this can't be sustainable, this model. I think it's been much more sustainable than it ought to have been or than we predicted. And I'm trying to kind of show you where we are on that. But I still think ultimately, this has to go wrong. That's my view. And I want to end with this picture from the New York Times in August, which is AI. We all think, I just mentioned AI as a tool for controlling people in China and the social credit system. Well, it turns out AI is also a way of protesting. So here's a dissident. He'd left the country by the time he did this, projecting, maybe you saw this story, projecting this on an apartment building in Chongqing in August. Overthrow the tyranny of the Communist Party. My Chinese is non-existent, so you can check the translation by the New York Times. Overthrow the tyranny of the Communist Party. Freedom is no gift. Take it back. Rise up, you who refuse to be slaves. So I don't have the time to talk about, why I think this is kind of part of the deep cultural history of all kind of humans on Earth. But I think it's this which sort of says, I still believe this is a transitory equilibrium. Anyway, I talked for much too long, and let me stop here. Yes, thank you.
We will now proceed to the Q&A session, which will be moderated by Dean Spiros Maniatis of the School of Political Science and Economics. Dean Maniatis and Professor Robinson, please.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I'm delighted that I am an intellectual property lawyer, because if you look at scientists, economists, and lawyers are at the bottom, but at least I am an intellectual property lawyer. It's interesting what you mentioned about the patent system, because you can see how technology challenges the patent system today, and how the concentration of power in terms of technology businesses challenge, again, the patent system. But we have moved away from the patent system being evidence of the political system, and the political system has taken over. So the transition, if you like, is a good thing. Also very interesting, in Chongqing, they have one of the most active regional intellectual property offices in China. So perhaps this is an explanation. We have a lot of questions, I'm sure, from our students. What I would like to ask is something that appears to be very banal, but it will help us understand a little bit about the whole concept of the Nobel Prize. And sometimes we don't ask the question because we think it's too simplistic. So what were you doing when you realized that you won the Nobel Prize? Or when did you realize that?
Usually I'm worrying about the 20 things I should have done, but I haven't done. I have a list usually. I make lists, and I have lists of all the things that I haven't done. That's like my life, So I was actually sleeping. They call you at 4 o'clock in the morning, so I was fast asleep with my phone off. And my wife doesn't sleep. She's a sort of insomniac. So one of my friends, longtime collaborator, who's a professor in Norway, he watched the thing live, and then he knew I would be asleep, so he called my wife up and told her, get him up, he won the Nobel Prize. So she was like shaking me awake. They'd been calling my telephone for half an hour. And then at 4:30, she got me up, you know, and it's a pretty weird experience, I have to say, like, because your first, I mean, I honestly, like, I never thought about stuff like that. And thinking about things like that is the biggest way to make yourself miserable, you know. Like, I personally feel, you know, I've been so fortunate in life. I've been so fortunate kind of in my career. You know, I've had people who really helped me and supported me. I've just, you know, if you'd asked me when I was 20 years old, like, what would like your optimal life look like? That kind of panned out, which is crazy. You know, it's totally crazy. Like, what was the probability of that happening? So thinking about stuff like that is just ridiculous, you know, because I've just been so lucky already, you know. So we never think about stuff like that. I honestly can tell you, like, Daron and I, we've been working together since 1992. We've never had one conversation in 30, all those years, ever. We never had one conversation about the Nobel Prize or what we get the Nobel, blah, blah, blah. So and then when it happens, it's completely weird because as I was joking at the start, suddenly everyone treats you completely differently. They all become like really deferential. And no, it's just very strange. Yeah, very strange. And they think you're going to become completely useless also. Like, basically, like, nobody ever thinks, they just invite you to do after dinner speeches. You know, that's what I do now. I do after dinner speeches. That's yes. The end of the career. I know, but that's not my self-image. You know, my self-image is like, oh, there's so many things I don't understand, and I have so many things I want to do, you know.
Okay, we will keep on inviting you back for more things to happen here, to keep you intellectually entertained. Excellent. Any questions from our students? Let's start at the front.
Hello. Thank you for the amazing speech, Professor Robinson. I was wondering, in the speech you treated populations as a rigid body, and I was wondering if there would be, if it would be beneficial to have a more qualitative view of populations. So when you were taking the example of Qatar and Singapore, there are two economies that are absolutely doing really, really well, but they're also really well known for hard to get their citizenships, and they treat their immigrant workers as second-class population. And for the examples of Western Europe, for instance, I mean, I've been living in France for the past 2 years, and over there's a sentiment that they are gathering a lot of workers from the MENA regions, from the Middle East and Northern Africa, and they are losing their top talents to the US due to brain drain. And in the US, it's an amazing economy by means of GDP per capita, but they're also known for having a high wealth inequality. And so they treat their top earners really, really well. I mean, it comes reducing taxes a lot to top earners as well. And I was wondering, for someone who just wants to maximize economic output, would it be of interest for them to view the population in different classes of economic powers and then treat those classes differently, and in the meantime providing a means of economic mobility throughout classes so that you can, such as what you said with meritocracy, you can earn your place in top universities and get hiring jobs from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. There was like probably 10 questions there, but I think there's a lot of trade-offs. I'm not really advocating the Qatar. You could say people come to Qatar, voluntarily. Nobody forces people to come to Qatar, but there's also lots of things not to like about that model. I agree. And for example, in Taiwan, as I understand it, migrants who come here, the same labor laws apply to them as to apply to other people, and there's a lot of political resistance to actually creating such a system, So I'm not advocating, I'm just saying there are these different models. I think it's a bit, in a globalized world, think about, how Taiwan has flourished. You flourished by integrating yourself into the world economy. You haven't, I can tell that story about the British Industrial Revolution as British people struggling with nature and innovating and coming up with, but the world is not like that now. The world is much more integrated and global, and options and strategies and possibilities are different. And so I just wanted to throw that out there, but I think there's a lot of complicated trade-offs of the sort you're alluding to, and I think, one of the problems at the moment in the United States is that there's possibly because of the size, it's interesting, that in economic theory, there's no real kind of result, there's no real claim about like the size of the country kind of mattering at all, but actually that can't be right, it's an interesting research topic because you see in the Chinese case, it's somehow the scale of it is somehow important, that even if the political economy, is kind of what I'm calling extractive, somehow you have 1 billion people, and that has implications for the extent of innovation, it seems to me, and it could be imperfect, but maybe an imperfect system works better at such scale, and there's no kind of real theory about that in economics. It's a really interesting topic, and the US is big also, and I think that the US has this idea that we can just go it alone kind of thing, but that would never occur as being a sensible idea to someone in Taiwan, I guess. So I think those questions are great. There's lots of trade-offs. I wasn't really trying to take a position.
It's also interesting how societies develop. In Qatar, they have one of the most interesting museums on slavery. And Qataris accept that part of what they were doing until recently constituted modern slavery. You see how the societies do progress and change, develop.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm from Korea, South Korea, and PhD student. I just wonder that, do you think the Japan's colonial era gave some contribution to setting the inclusive institution to Taiwan and Korea?
The Japanese colonial period. That's a very contentious topic in South Korea, I've learnt.
Not answer.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's an academic discussion about what was the impact of Japanese colonialism, on South Korea, and I'm not sure I really have ever come to a conclusion about that. People would say that President Park, who served in the Japanese army in Manchuria and whatever, he learned a lot, kind of firsthand, of how things were done in Japan, and that shaped a lot his kind of model of industrialization, which he adopted in the 1960s. But I think, if you look at business leaders, if you look at all these chaebol, for me, the Korean sort of economic successes, it's really this incredible private sector entrepreneurship, Samsung, Hyundai, and if you look into the details of how those people got started, like Hyundai, Hyundai had more to do with the US military, than it had to do with the Japanese, meaning and what about the land reform? And, people make arguments that, well, the land reform was possible because, you could expropriate a lot of people who collaborated with the Japanese. And that seems like a rather indirect kind of mechanism and stuff like that. So I think it's a very interesting hypothesis. I think also in the Taiwanese case, we're sitting here in the fruits of Japanese colonialism, I mean, all these buildings and stuff, and I was at the presidential, palace or whatever it is. But I think to my knowledge, there's no good empirical paper looking in economics. So it's actually a great research topic if you could figure out a research design to test a sort of more specific mechanism of how Japanese colonialism kind of, impacted Korean or Taiwanese development. I have to say, being British and having worked in sub-Saharan Africa, for 30 years, I've come to conclude, that the legacy of British colonialism in Africa is almost totally and utterly negative. So it's very difficult for me to sort of come to terms with the idea that there might be something positive about colonialism. But, I understand it was very different sort of colonialism. By the way that Japan integrated, it was very different from British colonialism. So.
Thank you. There's another question there.
Hello. First of all, Professor, I would like to thank you for this wonderful presentation, and it was really special for me to hear about the argument of such an important book of our century directly from this author. And I would like to ask a question regarding a statement that your colleague and the co-author of Why Nations Fail, Professor Daron Acemoglu, made in Turkish media. He also said if in 15 years China has caught up with the United States, I would have to admit that our thesis on democracy were wrong. So given that China continues to grow while maintaining its centralized authoritarian regime, and do you share this? Do you share the same view as Professor Acemoglu? If so, can you elaborate on this?
Well, I'm not responsible for what he says. I would say there's different claims here. One claim is an empirical claim. So we've done empirical research on the connection between democracy and public policy and economic growth, and I think those results, which are kind of widely accepted, and show that democracy is associated with systematically better public policy and faster economic growth. Okay, but there's many different sorts of democracies, and there's many different sorts of autocracies. Okay, and I think that's what I was struggling. What we claim, if you look historically, not just at the kind of statistical analysis, is that there's no kind of precedent for autocracy creating a very successful economy, and I think. There's lots of mechanisms. There's lots of theoretical mechanisms, which suggest that. And I talked a little bit about that, like power tends to corrupt. So there's theoretical mechanisms. So why don't those mechanisms seem to operate in China? Well, there's other mechanisms. That's the problem with social science. There's many different mechanisms, and you're always trying to kind of strike the balance of, what does the evidence say about which mechanisms are likely to dominate in a particular context. There's only one question in social science, I always think, which is in what circumstances? That's the question. So I think many of those mechanisms, as I try to talk about a little bit, they're very kind of regionally based or culturally based or historically based, and could they be or they may be technologically based. We're in a new era technologically. Maybe that allows for something, which was never possible. Maybe it's possible to control people and disentangle the economy, in a way that's never been happened before in world history. And that could happen. It could. The future is not the same as the past. And so, but based on, the evidence as we understand it, I wouldn't put so much emphasis on democracy, and I do think so I'm not sure if I'm answering your question very well, but let me just say one thing that I've learned, working in Africa, which I should have known since I'm British anyway, which is, there's many different sorts of legitimate political systems, I could tell you about, one of my friend's villages in eastern Nigeria, where, the political institutions in the village are the most powerful people politically are the oldest man and the oldest woman. Okay. Now, why would the oldest person be so important? Well, because the oldest person is closest to the ancestors. Now, that's an interesting way of justifying political authority. But I would say that's a very legitimate system in that village. The Nigerians, my friends, they're all happy with that. It's been there, for time out of mind, as we say in England. And, and I think, as I said, I sort of said a little bit, I think, of what going on in East Asia is you have that very different, there's a very different historical political equilibrium. There's a very different way here of legitimizing political power or legitimate authority. And it's very different from the Western tradition. If you read Aristotle's Politics, Aristotle, has this long description of basically how every political institution gets messed up, because there's always agency problems. Monarchy turns into despotism. Okay. So, but if you read Confucius, it's not like that at all. No, you just rectify yourself and, and then this kind of ripples up and then, he doesn't talk about political agency problems at all, So that's interesting too. And I think, so that would be, one criticism, I would say, rather than what Acemoglu said, Professor Acemoglu said, I would say Like our theory, you could criticize our theory by being, he's Turkish, but he grew up on the European side of the Bosphorus, So it's too Eurocentric. Like we've looked at European history too much. I've worked a lot in Africa and Latin America. Maybe the same mechanisms apply or whatever it is. And we've kind of assumed that those mechanisms apply everywhere, as social scientists do. We try to come up with these general kind of theories to explain the most sort of variation. But maybe they don't apply here, or maybe there's other mechanisms that are more important. And I'm not sure I'm enough of an expert to know the answer to that. But whenever I say that, the next word that comes to my mind is the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution.
And also, just highlight that you mentioned, you were talking about the rule of law rather than democracy.
Yeah.
And if you want to identify the characteristics of the concept of the rule of law, it's worth reading a very elegant book written by Lord Bingham. Bingham was a judge, a famed judge in the UK. And what he did is he decided to take away from the rule of law the concept of democracy and identify 7-8 characteristics. It's worth reading the book, actually. In my previous job, I was the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law was a part of what I was running. Yeah. Over there.
Thank you for your talk, Professor Robinson. I'm a graduate student in political science. I'm working on how authoritarian regions use communication disruption in grand strategies. In your 2022 commentary, Why Taiwan Matters, you emphasize that Taiwan's importance lies not only in geopolitics, but in its roles as a demonstration of an alternative institutional path. Building on the argument, I was wondering how you see communication infrastructure fitting into extractive institutions, not only in terms of political control, but also economic coordination. More specifically, do you think that disruption in communication, such as networks, undersea cables, or satellite systems, can weaken military command, governance, financial systems, and the digital economy, thereby undermining the overall capability and religions of democratic institutions. And related to that, do you see communication security cooperation among democracies as a form of collective institutions defense? Thank you.
I'm not sure what the question was. There were many questions. Yeah. I'm not sure this word. What was this word you're using? Like convocation?
I think cooperation in democracy.
I mean, I think, one thing we're often accused of, Professor Acemoglu and I, is not paying enough attention to kind of international relations and sort of geopolitics. Like a lot of the book, geopolitics and international relations, in our theory and a lot of our research, kind of is very important at some moments, like colonialism, for example, in the colonization of the Americas or in Africa or Asia or whatever. Then, that's about geopolitics, but then there's a kind of internal dynamics of the institutions, of the politics of different societies kind of takes over. And I noticed that, we tend to discuss these cases kind of too much in isolation, probably. I think that's we're often criticized for that, and I think that's probably a weakness. I have to say, in my own defense, it's always because, whenever I've started studying a country in more detail, it's always those internal dynamics. Maybe that's just what you're studying, and it's like some psychological mechanism. They always sort of loom larger, and they always take on the most kind of important thing. But obviously at this moment in the world where geopolitics seems so significant, that, I would say, there's always these challenges, and I think one challenge, is building inclusive institutions at a global level. I think that's been successful in many ways in the post-Second World War epoch. We tried to build institutions, pretty inclusive institutions on a global scale, because many problems are global. Climate change is a global problem. Interstate warfare is a problem, and so I've never done research on that or worked on that. I guess what I usually say, when people talk about, like in Korea, like for example, I was in Korea in the summer, and everyone starts talking about like all of these problems and things like that. But like from my perspective, I sort of think, really? I mean, you go into a Starbucks in Seoul, there's like a bomb shelter. There's a sign and there's a bomb shelter underneath the Starbucks. We don't have that in Chicago. You're, 50 kilometers from the demilitarized zone, and the North Korean, if you read about the history of Hyundai, twice, Mr. Chung's, everything was just trashed because the North Korean army invaded Seoul and like destroyed everything, all his capital, he lost everything. He just started again, So it's this immense resilience, of successful societies. And Taiwan is the same, like here you've built this extraordinary, this is one of the most successful instances of world economic history in this unbelievably challenging context where people don't recognize your sovereignty. You don't have representation in any of these institutions. You have China bullying you, threatening you. But nevertheless, you've just got on with it, and you've built this incredibly successful society. So I understand there's lots of challenges, but I guess I'm always more impressed by the extraordinary resilience that people can show in these contexts.
And also, there's always a risk that if you focus too much on geopolitics, you can have a domino effect of failure. One failed state can influence what's happening elsewhere in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Professor Robinson. I'm also a PhD student from political science, and I think the talk is really insightful, and I found it really interesting. So I have a follow-up question to that guy. As you say, the inclusive economic and political institutions allows and helps creativity, innovation, technology to grow, but I think it's at first. Because right now, lots of the wealthy country on the box, the left upper box that you just show, right? Like the US, they're facing inequality issue. Like most of maybe over 80 or 90% of the wealth are concentrated in the hands of only 5% of people, especially in Silicon Valley or in Wall Street. And those businessmen kind of extract this money to influence the policymakers in Washington, D.C. To Donald Trump may listen to lots of his donors to make his public policy, right? So the political institution become a little bit extractive because those businessmen can influence it. So I think, can we say that this inclusive economic and political institutions kind of make itself extractive economic and political institutions? And how can we fix this problem? If we cannot fix this problem, then how can we convince another extractive institutions like China to move into our political institutions?
Yeah. That's my question. Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I think what we discuss in Why Nations Fail is that in any inclusive society, there's always incentive to create extractive institutions, and you see it many times in U.S. history, by the way. So first of all, there's always gray areas, meaning there's no such thing as a perfect society. So the distinction between inclusive and extractive institutions is way too simplistic. Think about the US South, black people, African Americans were hideously exploited in the US South, and they couldn't vote, up until the mid 1960s, So just to sort of emphasize this dichotomy is too simplistic, but there's always, we talk about, think about the robber barons. For me, and many people are making this, comparison between the so-called Gilded Age, in the second half of the 19th century when all these robber barons, basically Rockefeller and, who started the University of Chicago, by the way. But many of them started universities, Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, Vanderbilt, philanthropists, whatever, but ruthless business people trying to influence politics, etc., including Rockefeller. So, I think we're at a similar moment. I think the biggest problem in the United States at the moment, which is less true about the 19th century, is that the institutions have somehow failed to be inclusive in many ways. If you look at, if you break down the dynamics of wages by real wages adjusted for changes in prices over the last 50 years by levels of educational attainment, people who don't have a college degree in the United States have lower wages now than they had 50 years ago. And that's the majority of people in the United States. So the median person in the United States is worse off now than they were 50 years ago. So for me, that's even more striking than these facts about inequality. That's part of it, obviously. And this enormous returns to having an education, has appeared in the United States. And it's people like me who are benefiting. We're all in denial and we're all getting really upset, because the US government took our USAID grant away from us and we're all feeling, but we don't understand how privileged we are. If you look at, in my lifetime, my career in the United States, the real income growth of professors is just ludicrous. It's off the chart. Where the average people are worse off. We're the beneficiaries. How are we the beneficiaries? Well, we have a business school that makes tens of millions of dollars of profit. What's the business school selling? It's selling access to the top 1% of the income distribution, basically. So those rents spill over, into everybody, but we're not admitting that. We're saying, no, we get paid the value of our productivity, and sometimes I resort to economics. No. So I think there's a big failure of inclusion in the United States. That's what's, and that for me is the fundamental, that's what's creating all this problem. That's what's creating all these problems. That's what's creating the political basis for Mr. Trump and all of that, and let me say two things about this moment that reveals kind of weakness, I would say, in our theory. One is, when we talk about the Gilded Age, or when we talk about the kind of transition, we talk about Venice is our kind of lead example, we talk about these transition from kind of inclusive to extractive institutions. We kind of make it out that this is a sort of coup d'etat from the top. It's like the elites, and that's sort of what you're saying. Mr. Musk spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to influence the election. Money comes into politics and the elites control the system. But what's striking about the US moment now is that this is also very popular. There's millions and millions of people who are quite happy with this, who've not been bribed by Mr. Musk or anything else. They're so discontented by this collapse of inclusion in a fundamental way in the United States, I think. So it's a much more popular collapse or much more popular challenge to the system that perhaps, we never really anticipated that inclusive societies could fail to become inclusive in this way. Why has the US failed to become inclusive? Because institutions haven't adapted to changes in the world. Labor market institutions, deunionization, kind of reinvention of corporate governance. There's many things going on at the same time. Globalization, the spread of computers. When I was a PhD student, every professor at Yale had an assistant or a secretary, whatever, My thesis advisor used to dictate his papers, can you believe that, to his assistant, who would type them. Nobody has, those people all disappeared. They disappeared. They're not unemployed, but they pushed wages down, So I think these institutions haven't adapted. They haven't adapted to the changing world, and now the world is changing even faster with AI. And that's one, for me, the big problem. That's created a challenge to the system, which we didn't really anticipate. The other thing, which I find kind of fascinating, and I shouldn't start talking about, is I think, Professor Acemoglu and I, we're much too materialist. We were both much too influenced by Marxism, in our youth, in our misspent youths. And we're much too, and this is true generally about social science. It's less true about political science. It's very true about economics, of course. But we don't pay enough attention to ideas, and the thing that really strikes me about the United States at the moment is there's a crisis there's an ideological crisis. There's a crisis of the liberal state. You know, the one thing that unites the members of Mr. Trump's coalition is antipathy to liberalism in different domains. It could be economic liberalism. It could be social liberalism. You know, it could be gay rights. It could be vaccinations. It could be antipathy towards, you know, universities, which kind of reproduce this liberal world. You know, and that's an ideological, it's not just about economics. The economics is there, but it's also an ideological crisis, a kind of ideational crisis. And I think we underestimated a lot the role of ideas in a kind of establishing these institutional equilibria. And I think, you know, that somehow come up in this discussion of East Asia. And I think that's something that I find fascinating, you know, and we're trying to work on, but we don't really know how to do it.
I think this is a brilliant answer. We finished our time. We don't have time for another question. Maybe we're going to take one very quick question. Okay, you're very eager. Very quick question, and that's the last one.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for coming to NTU. I actually went to U Chicago, but I had to come to NTU to hear your speech. So hopefully this is considered a quick question. So I'm wondering if you've looked into the institutions in Vietnam and if you would consider Vietnam to exhibit what you would call inclusive economic and political institutions. And I ask this because in recent years there have been a lot of reports predicting that Vietnam could potentially replace China in the next 20 to 50 years. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know very much about Vietnam. I mean, my superficial reading of Vietnam was, it had a socialist state. It had many similarities with China. It saw what was happening in China, and in the 1980s, it basically did what China had started doing in the late 1970s, which was sort of dismantling the socialist economy. Allowing, using my language, making economic institutions more inclusive. And that coincided with a rapid increase in the rate of economic growth, So I think that's my take on that. I do think, if I was going to think about that in more detail, I think what seems fascinating about the Vietnamese case also is that's the one kind of part of East Asia in some sense that really had to fight, for its independence and fight for its sovereignty, fight against the French, fight against the Americans, So I guess that has a big impact on the legitimacy of the party, of the legitimacy of the political system, In a way, I don't know if the way that the Chinese, I would think that that aspect of the state or the legitimacy of the state, that's something very distinct and different, I guess, from the Chinese case. And maybe that's important, I mean, when I compare that to, say, the North Korea, why is it that North Korea can't do that, Because the system is too personalized and it's not institutionalized enough, and they're not confident enough that they'll be able to stay in power if they make this transition. Because to make the transition, you have to allow people to be free, you have to allow, and then, you have to give up on control. That's what I was talking about. So how do you square that circle? In North Korea, they don't think they can do it. But Vietnam was confident also because, I guess, of this history and because of the party so I don't know enough about it. I think if you thought about what I know about the deep history, it shares lots of things in common with China, the examination system, many philosophical ideas, again, the lack of a history of representative institutions. I would think many things are in common. So, I guess if I applied the same ideas to the Vietnamese case, I'd say this is extractive growth and it'll be transitory. But what I've also suggested this morning is, well, there's lots of mechanisms I don't really understand, and I always push back at China is, China is different, China is different. And so I'll push back at Vietnam is different too, but I'm not saying anything interesting. Yeah.
That's not true. Okay. So thank you very much. Let's express our gratitude for